Welcome to the Organizational Inclusionist. I'm your host, Grace Masuro. In this podcast series, we'll be delving deep into the pressing issues surrounding equality, diversity, and inclusion in both the workplace and the broader world. My goal is to foster understanding, inspire change, and amplify the voices of those advocating for a more inclusive and equitable society. Throughout this series, I'll be engaging in candid discussions with leaders, experts, activists, and changemakers from various fields. We'll explore the challenges, successes, and evolving landscapes of equality, diversity, and inclusion. From dismantling systematic biases to promoting equal opportunities for all, we'll touch on a broad range of topics. But we won't stop at discussing problems. We'll actively seek out solutions and actionable steps to drive positive change. Our aim is to inspire and empower you, our listeners, to take an active role in making the world a better place for everyone. This is the Organizational Inclusionist. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Organizational Inclusionist. My name is Grace Masuro and I am your host. And today I am joined by Gisele Marcus, all the way from the States. Very, very excited to have you. Thank you so much for joining me, Gisele.
Delighted to be here, Grace.
Amazing. So it's been a while since we spoke. I think it's been a few months. And since we spoke, so much has happened. I think the biggest challenge that has occurred since we last spoke is you have a new president.
Yes, we will on June 20th.
Right. How, from your perspective in your community, how have people received that?
Yeah, so of course, there's two camps. There's probably more than two, but clearly there is a fraction of individuals who, because he won, right, are really excited about the opportunity. I serve on a board for a publicly traded bank, so they are delighted. We were talking yesterday about just looking at some historical measures with an expert in the industry in terms of how his presidency will impact banking. So from a financial perspective, it's looking good. Then there are fractions of others, are not as excited about that, particularly those who have felt marginalized and on the fringes here in the United States. So for that group, I would say that it's challenging, but we have learned that this type of work, the type of work for diversity, equity, and inclusion, it really is a long game. So, and I would say we have seen challenges like these before in terms of fighting for civil rights in the 60s, in terms of the LGBTQ community seeking their rights, and for those rights to actually stick. So I would say we're somewhat in familiar territory.
It's challenging, but I always try and be a glass half full person. I feel like with challenges, we get to be and do some of the greatest things. It can be exhausting at times, but we move, right?
Yes.
But before we get stuck in, I'd love it if you could please introduce yourself to our listeners. So who is Gisele and what do you do?
Certainly. Love to. So I am Gisele Marcus, and currently I work in higher education here in the United States. I'm at an institution called Washington University in St. Louis. So I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, and I have two hats. So I like to say I'm double hatting in diversity, equity, and inclusion at a time when it's very challenging in our country. So I am a professor of practice. I teach a course that is required for our MBA students titled Leading Across Differences. And as a professor of practice, I teach the subject matter from the perspective of what's practical in the workplace for our students to thrive, working in an environment where there may be people that are different than them. And I'm also the vice dean for the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which means for my business school, I report to our dean, and I have responsibility for setting and executing the strategy for diversity, equity, and inclusion for our institution. And we are a private university here in the United States. Prior to that, I have been in corporate America since Jesus was a baby. I know I may not look like it, but I have been. And in corporate, I was in Fortune 250 organizations, and I served as an operations executive. And the roles, I would say, that I had latest in my career where it was me being a general manager, which means I was actually running businesses in Fortune 250 companies such as Johnson Controls, Thermo Fisher Scientific, Cushman and Wakefield. I also worked at AT&T. So those are some brands that may sound familiar. And in terms of being a general manager, what that consisted of was having responsibility for both the operations and the sales of a business. And the largest business that I've had the opportunity to run globally has been $800 million when I was at Johnson Controls.
Amazing. Thank you. So a really, really accomplished career, which is always beautiful to hear. There's a couple of things I want to touch on from your intro. So first of all, leading across difference. For you to be able to make that a required course for the MBA students is bold. Like it's a really bold move. What impact, firstly, what challenges did you have, if any, in making that a required? And what impact have you seen it have so far on the students that have taken it?
Certainly. So I would like to take credit for it becoming a required course. So what happened was it became a required course before I came to the institution, and I was actually hired to design the curriculum. And it became required because the students had been demanding it, and it had been my understanding for up to a decade. Students had been asking for a course like this one. So that's how it happened. But I would
Mm,
say I agree with you. It is a bold move for a university to do that in our country.
mm,
And it's been, let's see, for the past 3 years, it has been a requirement. To your question around how has it been for me? So I would say my institution, for the most part, the students that say yes to for our program typically are those who are open to the concept of differences.
mm,
Those who understand that when you look at the census, which is how we count people here in the United States, that if you look at it 1970 to 2050, there is a browning of the United States where it is becoming a lot more diverse. And one thing for sure, when you go into the workplace that you're going to do, you're going to work with people. And unless you work in a monolithic organization where everyone has the same ethnicity, the same gender, the same race, from the same geography, if you're not going to walk into one of those situations, which very few people do, you are going to work with people who are different from you.
mm.
And our school, our institution really wants our students to be able to walk boldly into that and successfully into that. People working in teams has increased tremendously. If I think about when I entered the workplace as a younger person in the 90s, a lot of work was independent. You were
Mm,
getting a lot of things done on your own. But today you find yourself working more so in teams, working in groups, having to work toward a common goal where the individuals on the team have different ideas about how to get there.
mm.
And in order to be successful in so doing, you want to be victorious. And to be victorious, you need to know how to work with people that are different from you. So I would say the majority of the students have really embraced it. We also have a very international group of students. So in the MBA program last year, of about 100 students, 20 we had 29 countries represented.
Wow.
So it's also diversity in terms of where you're from geographically. So I would say the international students, it can be a stretch depending on where they're from,
Mm,
because the concept of racism or isms can be something that, of course, is different from country to country, right? So every
yeah.
country has its own privileged people and people that aren't privileged. That is for sure. But I find that the international students sometimes are just gazing at us when we talk about the history, of racism in business.
Mm,
And you really have to also give them a little bit more history in terms of how did we get here? Because
yeah.
because if you haven't dealt with it, you don't understand. And then how it happened in the United States. So thank goodness I have a colleague who's in the School of Arts and Sciences, who is a professor of African American studies, who his life's work is really around the study of race and ethnicity. So I bring him into the course, particularly for my international students, because he talks about the history of race and ethnicity before we can even get into the business side of it. Then I
Excellent.
have the school of students, right, who are not so encouraged by the topic. The fact that we layer, it's a required course, so you don't really have a choice of taking it. So there are some students, but I would say it's a small percentage, who don't feel that it's necessary, who don't may not speak up in the classroom with their voice to be negative, but sometimes can make a disturbance outside the classroom.
Mm,
So that has been the challenge. But what I've learned just through some of the training I've taken is how can I pull everyone into the classroom experience? Because when you think about it, everyone is paying for a seat, in
Mm,
our institution, and everyone's expected to walk away with learning. So what I've learned to do is to come up with methods where students that may be anti-DEI are able to share their insights and opinions without feeling like they're being outed or without feeling uncomfortable.
mm,
And how I've done that is there's a organization here in the United States called Pew Research, and they've done a study about how people feel about DEI in the workplace.
mm,
And I would say about 55% of people are for it. So I call them, they're green. I would say there are about maybe like 30% of people who are in the middle, right? They're not going to make a wave, but they're not going to be championing it either. And then there's that 20% or 15 or so who totally are against it. So what I've done is I've created a stoplight scenario where I'm using a red, yellow, green. So you're green if you're for it, you're yellow if you're in the middle, and you're red if you're just totally opposed. So what I do is I give them examples, I give them case studies, and I'll say, in this scenario, if you were a red person, how might you behave? If you were a green person, how might you behave? And I think what that's done is it's allowed all the students to actually have a voice without calling out, I might be anti or
yeah.
I might be for, and it gives them the opportunity to put themselves in the seat of a third person, which is good
Mm.
for learning because students need to know how to think about when they're in scenarios if someone responds from either of those three areas.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the things that you touched on that is so true and so important is, the world looks different today in terms of how we work, right? Most of us do work in teams. And I think, one of the things that I talk about a lot in the work that I do is the impact that culture has on the way that we show up in our teams. And I think this course is so important in making people aware of, there are differences between some of us. And, just having that awareness of how that might impact the way that we navigate the world of work and how we can lead more effectively when there is diversity in those teams is brilliant. So we know, I think anyone across the world knows that DEI in the US is facing some real challenges. We're seeing it here in the UK and in other parts of the world, but I feel very much like the world is watching the US and almost responding to that. We've seen budgets being pulled in organizations, at state schools. We've seen some of what's going on in the legislature around trying to, ban DEI through legislation. But private universities like yours, or some private universities maybe, and I think you can probably speak to that more, seem to be staying committed to that. Why do you think DEI has become so divisive, and how can we keep the momentum going?
Well, it's become divisive because individuals, and I would say those mostly in politics, have just really demonized the words.
Mm,
And when you break down the constructs of what diversity is, which is just having people that are different, equity in terms of leveling the playing field so that everyone has equal access to opportunities, and inclusion where people feel that they're being heard, they're being valued in the workplace. And individually, when you think of those constructs, I mean, I struggle with how is that offensive or
mm,
how is that something we would not want?
yeah.
And the conclusion that I mostly come to, and this is something my students and I talk about, like, because we have to talk about this subject matter. This is part of my course, that there is an anti-DEI movement out here. Why is that? And what can we do about it? So I would say we have to respect the fact that there are people who have different opinions. But
Mm,
the challenge, I believe, is really coming, I mean, this is my, personal opinion, is coming from a place of fear.
yeah.
We're in a country where just putting it out there on the table, being Caucasian and being male has been somewhat the call of the day in the workplace. And they are still the leaders of industry and pretty much in the majority of industries that you look into. So when you think about the census and the fact that the demographics are changing, the fact that now you have some leaders that look like you and I, in the workplace, not in magnificent, very high numbers, by the way, but just the fact that we show up as being qualified and sometimes overqualified.
Mm.
I believe that some people are believing it's a zero-sum game, right? So if you have more of us, there's this feeling, well, there's less of us.
Yeah.
And it's this, this fight for staying in power. And, my thought is there is so much work opportunity to go around. And why not share that with people that are qualified to actually do the work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I think, we've seen the impact that fear has on the way that we treat each other as humans. I think if we look at pretty much every atrocity that's happened or that has been done by humans to fellow humans, I definitely think fear has been a massive driver. And I get it as well. There is this fear, like you said, that it's a zero-sum game. So, if you give more in this area, it means this area loses out, or this group loses out. But I think there's also this, we need a reality check. The things that have happened in the past were wrong. And when we look at slavery, when we look at how, Black people were treated as cattle, as stock, purely based on the myth that was created many, many moons ago that our skin complexion or color makes us less than. I think it's really important that we wake up to the fact that actually that's not true, firstly. And the only reason that we still see people holding true to that is because they want that justification to challenge things like DEI. I think there's fear, but I think there's also greed in it. It's this view that, I want to have as much as I can. And in order to do that, I need to find a way of justifying holding on to this. And through some of the divisive conversations that we see happening, through some of the crazy rhetoric around, DEI leaves us behind, DEI is racist, things like that we just know aren't true. But there's almost, if you make enough noise about something, then someone's going to start to believe you. And we're definitely seeing a lot of that. But also, I think there's also people believe what they want to believe, right? If something essentially supports an innate view that someone has about something or supports overcoming a fear that someone has of something. So if we ban DEI because it's racist, then that's great for me because I was really scared that, if we make everything fair, I'm going to lose out. So I am fully on board with you. I agree DEI is racist, even though deep down inside, I know it's not, but it meets my objectives. And therefore I'm going to stand with you and I'm going to make as much noise about this as possible. But you've seen DEI work globally, and firsthand, as a lot of us do, that it's not a one size fits all. You alluded to it earlier when you talked about just how diverse the students on your course are, and the fact that for some of them, they don't understand racism because it's not necessarily something that comes up in their country, for example. And I know that when I was born in Nigeria, and growing up there, racism isn't something that was discussed because we all look the same. We didn't experience racism. But what cultural nuances stand out to you, and why is understanding those differences so important?
Sure. So I would say some cultural nuances. At my institution, we actually send students on what we call a global immersion. So it gives them the opportunity to experience other countries together, right?
Mm.
And it gives them the opportunity to visit companies in other parts of the world as a group. And they have professors that are teaching courses while they're there. So for example, the students went to Singapore, and Singapore is a country that is not open, right, to those that are of the LGBTQ community. And here in the United States, at my institution, we are open to that. Matter of fact, my dean is gay. He's a Caucasian male, but he is in fact gay. So we had to explain to our students that, okay, going on this trip, and myself and my team were a part of this, explaining to them that public displays of affection, those things are illegal. And, if you get caught doing them, there are legal ramifications for that. And, so You wouldn't have to do that here in the United States. So that's an example of it where it might be different. And also I have my students this is actually one of the most popular parts of my course. I have a section on DEI around the globe. Where the students as teams actually select a country and they do a DEI analysis of that country. So they tell me, well, who are the privileged people? Who are the people that aren't privileged? How did that come to be? Because there's always some history about how that has happened. And then I asked them to pick a diversity dimension. So it could be religion, it could be neurodiversity, it could be a physical disability. And I asked them to tell me, how does that manifest in the workplace? What does that look like? And then they're also asked to put on their thinking hat of the leader of that country, and if that leader had a magic wand, what is it that they may do differently? And to what avail, meaning what difference would it make in their country? So there are some countries where, particularly, let's say the Middle East, for example, women can't be judges, for example, in most parts of the Middle East. And how does that impact the Middle East? What does that do to women there? So there are just so many dimensions, which is why I'm honored to be a part of an institution that believes a course like this is necessary. And quite frankly, I've only been able to find one other institution here in the United States that has a required diversity, equity, and inclusion course. Oftentimes when I see it, it's offered as an elective.
No, exactly. That's really interesting. And thank you for that. I think we know that, like you said at the start of this, and I also mentioned as well, that we are entering another challenging period in the world of DE&I, right? But from your perspective, what's next for DEI leaders globally? What challenges should we be preparing for? And what opportunities excite you the most?
Sure. So we should be preparing for the fact that there are businesses, institutions who are defunding or getting rid of these types of programs. So let's say Walmart is one. So that's a company that's known globally. And they actually have 42% of their employees look like you and I. 30% of their customers look like you and I. So I find it interesting that they would say, we're no longer going to support this, remove the individuals that are in leadership. And it's my understanding, too, that the person that led supplier diversity, because I always thought they did a great job in terms of allowing diverse suppliers to actually have their products in their stores. And that person left, I believe, a year ago. And they never replaced that person. So it's kind of just been slowly happening.
Yeah.
And I just feel that, companies just feel a little more emboldened. So when we know these things, as my grandmother used to say, when you know better, you do better.
Right.
So my course of action is, is that if there are organizations that aren't going to support the things that I value, then I'm personally not going to spend my money there.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with some of the things that I drink. Like there's a particular vodka that I like when I have my martinis. And just the other day, I was at dinner and I said, please don't give me X brand. And then someone that was at the table with me was like, well, why did you say that? And I said, because they don't have the same values that I have. So I think that's one thing.
Definitely. It's so important as well. So important. I did see, I'm a member of a number of networks, and one of them were talking about the Walmart situation just this morning. So it's so interesting that you raised that, first of all.
So it's that. And then it's also, as a DEI leader, it's always also about how do you show up in the room, sometimes as the only person who has this as a value.
Yeah.
So you mentioned it earlier, it can get exhausting, but we still have to stay the course because we know that in history, we have had troughs and we have had victories. So we have to believe that the world is going to stay the same. So we're still going to have victories, but it can really feel isolating when you are the only person with a view. And I've had that opportunity in many spaces that I'm a part of. And when you walk away, it's heavy.
Absolutely.
But I feel that I'm doing the right thing because it aligns with my values. And if I don't do that, the challenge is I don't rest well. Like when my sleep is not peaceful. And I'm
No.
not willing to give that up. And I recognize that what we're talking about, you mentioned it too, is culture. And culture, I would say, is one of the most challenging things I've ever had to change in my career. And as being a DEI leader, it's important to recognize the places where you plant your feet, whether that's where you work or whether that's where you give back to the community, and be clear about if their website says they're about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a value of theirs, test it.
Yeah.
Ask in your interview and go beyond that, because sometimes in interviews, people just aren't honest about what the culture of a company is. So you go and ask. On social media is so easy. Who do you know that's in that company, or who do you know that knows someone that's in that organization, and find out. Because for me, it's funny. I said when I was younger, it wasn't something that was this value wasn't something that I would say when I'm looking for a new opportunity. This is something that I want. But now it is, because if I'm not working in a culture that values that, I'm not going to give 100% of myself in that environment. And that is, research says, right, that if employees are not engaged, you're not going to get the best out of them. So it's incumbent on us as leaders in this space to make sure that we find ourselves in environments that are welcoming.
I think that's so important as well. And I think what I've really noticed is I remember when I first started my career, I was looking for the things that drove me were essentially salary and maybe like what the company, is it a nice brand, is it a popular brand, etc. But now as a parent, as an adult, I look for something completely different in my work. It's become about more than just me. It's now about the world that my daughter enters when she's ready for work. And I think that that is something that's so important. But also with what we're seeing in the generations that are coming, they're asking for a lot more. They're demanding for a lot more from work. And I think that's why it's so important for us to continue this work. I did a post about this a while ago, but we stand on the shoulders of giants, and it's now on us to become those giants for the generations that are coming. And I think that is just so, so important. Who are you going to be a giant for in this work? Do you know what I mean? And I think for me, that is definitely something that makes me continue this work despite it being exhausting. And I also talk about the fact that I don't think DEI is fun. It's not fun at all, right? It has fun moments.
Yeah.
Like, when you see like the pin drop for someone, and you see they get it. Beautiful moments. But when you have lived experience of marginalization and you're doing this work, you're doing it for a greater good. And that sometimes means that you run into a brick wall often. It means that sometimes you're attacked for the things that you talk about and the things that you do. It means you're regularly challenged about what you do. You're not seen as an authority, despite your lived experience and your academic knowledge and your professional experience, purely because of the color of your skin. That is a challenge to people. But it shouldn't be something, despite the exhaustion, it shouldn't be something that stops us from doing what we do, because this work is so important. And when we look at what other people have gone through to give us the freedoms that we have today, we cannot give up this work. There's still so much to do, despite how far we've come. Gisele, thank you so much for your time today. I think what I would love is if you could offer a word of encouragement or wisdom to anyone who is currently really struggling with the attacks that are taking place in the States in particular, but also internationally against DEI work. What would your word of encouragement or wisdom be for those individuals?
Yes, my word of encouragement would be to band together with individuals like you and I, others who are proponents of the work, because I actually get energy from that, even if they're not in my industry. And there are so many of us that are here in the world and here in the United States. So I would say hold firm to people who value what you value. And when you're in those times when you're challenged and you feel like you're the only person in the room, and you feel that there are people whispering when you're not in the room, and it gets heavy, hold firm to that network, hold firm to allies, because we're going to need each other to move the needle from where we are today to where we want to be in a world and in a country where we feel valued, where we feel heard, and where we feel that we can be difference makers.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gisele. It's been such a pleasure having you.
You as well. It has been a delight. I totally enjoy watching you on social media. You are amazing. And I
Thank you.
appreciate that you say what's on your mind and you do so in a way that's respectful and in a way that hopefully pierces the mind of those who may think otherwise about the DEI space. So thank you for your work.
Thank you so much. That means the world to me. Take care, Gisele.
Take care.